October is all about showcasing technology, impact, and creativity that vibrates through the PhillyCAM network. PhillyCAM's community is full of media shakers, content innovators, and neighborhood storytellers. Brought to you by our 2023 People Power Media Fest. You're watching us on PhillyCAM's TV station and listening to us on our low-power radio station, WPPM 106.5 FM. This is the Connecting Audio Storytellers panel here at the People Power Media Fest. I'm Alex Lewis.
There's a little echo on the left side.
I'm a longtime radio producer, podcast producer here in Philadelphia. I'm also the co-founder of a production company called Row Home Productions. And I'm here with three amazing Philadelphia area podcast radio makers, and I'm going to introduce them from my left to right. We have Karen Gross, a creative entrepreneur, singer, and communications strategist who is passionate about helping women harness the power of their voices and align their creativity with their careers. Today, she connects, empowers, and lights up audiences as a singer, speaker, MC, and the host and founder of She Rocked It, a media and mentorship platform creative, courageous women. She also continues to provide behind-the-scenes strategic communications guidance to thought leaders, executives, and entrepreneurs. And I highly recommend checking out her podcast, especially for the amazing theme song that she composed at the top of the show. Then we have Trinae Nuri, who I've known for quite a while now, the host of CityCast Philly, a daily news podcast that keeps you more connected to the city we love. Before CityCast, Trinae was the producer of the Wall Street Journal's What's News PM podcast. She also served as a fill-in host and producer for Your Money Briefing and Secrets of Wealthy Women shows. Trinae was a producer-reporter at WHYY, that's where we met, a host for the Philadelphia Young Playwrights podcast Mouthful, and was part of the inaugural cohort that created and launched PhillyCAM Voices. And then finally, Tezra Wilkins is an accomplished multimedia producer with over a decade of experience in media production and management. She has also produced several podcasts, including Love Now Media's Conscious Connections with Nicole Blackson, Heart to Heart, and I Know Your Name. In addition to her work in media, Tezra has been a speaker at several events, including Podcast Movement Conference and Ignite Philly 2023, as well as taught workshops in grant writing and audio field production. Her podcast, Who Taught You How to Drive, has not only garnered a dedicated following, but also earned her the prestigious title of the winner of the first international cohort of the PRX Google Podcast Creators Program in 2019. And it's an amazing show, and if anyone watching has driven around or lived in Philly for more than a month, I'm sure you think about driving and drivers all the time, and Tezra's podcast explores that topic in a fun and amazing and deep depth. So thank you for all being here.
Thank you.
I know after those long bios, I sort of prefaced this, but just one by one, can you just each briefly talk about what you're working on now, your main project, your main podcast, and just tell the audience a little bit about it. We'll start.
Sure. Well, first of all, it's such an honor to be among all of you. I mean, really, I'm just excited to learn also from each of you. So, as you said, I'm Karen Gross. I am the founder of She Rocked It, which is a media platform and a mentorship platform for creative and courageous women. And it started with our podcast in 2021. In the middle of lockdown. I have a background as a journalist and, as you mentioned, Alex, as a communications consultant, and I really have had the good fortune of getting to speak to a lot of leaders and artists over the years, powerful women and men, and would hear these incredible stories as I was in these sort of closed-door meetings as a speechwriter, communications consultant, or journalist, and launched She Rocked It to kind of open the door on the stories of really accomplished women and inspiring women so that other women and men could hear more about their lives and really what makes them tick, kind of the behind-the-scenes stories, behind the glory that, we don't often get to hear. And I was like hearing it, I said, oh my gosh, more people need to really hear this so we can learn from their journeys and we can all learn from each other. So I'm continuing to create the podcast up until now, 2023. We just finished I believe it's our 4th or 5th season, and our last season was focused on courageous entrepreneurs, women entrepreneurs, a lot of them from Philly, some of you might know. I was just at the the Pennsylvania Conference for Women, and I saw Lizzie's Love Cakes, Cassandra Burnett, who I just interviewed on the podcast. She had her stuff there. So, it's just been awesome to continue to celebrate women who are doing awesome things and to keep building our community.
I'm going to probably want to ask each of you in a moment about starting your own podcast, but we'll come back to that. Trinae.
Hey, everyone. I'm not sure if this is on.
You want to try to
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Hey, so right now I am the host of CityCast Philly, which Alex said is a daily news podcast. A lot of our work gears towards news. Obviously, we do recommendation shows, best places to get pizza in the city, but really it just connects you with the city. Each Friday, we have something called the Friday News Roundup. So myself and other reporters from the Inquirer, from WHYY, from Philly Voice, we just sit down and chat about the news. What else was there?
No,
No,
just
that's it?
describe
Okay.
it. Yeah.
It's a team of 4 of us. So as you can imagine, we are a daily show. So it's a lot of production, a lot of reading, a lot of just our own experiences as living in Philadelphia that we get to talk about on the show. And that's what I love to do every morning. So there's a component, we have a podcast and we have a newsletter. And both of those products come out in your inbox at 6 a.m. So, yeah.
Hello, everyone. So my podcast, Who Taught You How to Drive, has been on hiatus for a while, just because I have been doing so many other projects. But I work with an empathy-based news organization called Love Now Media, and there I kind of lead and oversee any podcasts that we're doing. So the podcast that I'm working on right now is called Dinner with Friends, and it's actually a youth-produced podcast. So it's for teens. They've done all the conceptual stuff. They do the editing. I'm there just as a guide, to support them and make sure that, they're doing everything according to our standards. But yeah, so that's just basically an interview podcast that they do. 4 of them produce it, 3 of them are the hosts. And they talk about things that teens and youth would normally be talking about. So it's kind of giving us adults kind of like a peek into their world and understanding what, the topics and things that they're, discussing. So they just finished 4 episodes. One was about, whether or not, you should still go to college, what's the value in that. They're going to be talking about things like staying culture and politics. So it's a really beautiful podcast. I think the youngest teen that we have is about 14, 15. So it's a wonderful project.
Well, although the panel is called Connecting Audio Storytellers, you probably noticed that everyone's talking about podcasts, which is unsurprising to me, though it would be possible we could be talking about any number of other, radio programs or audio tours or documentaries. And I just mentioned that in part because I want to ask how everyone kind of got into the audio medium, and I guess podcasting specifically. Podcasting is still relatively new, I would say, like maybe a little over a decade old, as something that people, a term that people know what that means. And for me, I'll just say for myself, I came to podcasting from being a radio producer, and just sort of naturally, organically, podcasting became the medium, the platform where you started sharing audio content. So I'll start from the other side. Tezra, how did you first get into audio?
I got into audio. It's funny because I, had been doing like film, doing producing in film for a while before I had discovered even what a podcast was. But I didn't really understand the importance of audio in film, so it was more of like the visual aspect to me. And, so I wasn't really thinking about audio and stuff. And at the time I was doing a lot of, work for other people, doing a lot of photography, film projects. And I was like, I just wanted to do something for myself. And I was doing a lot of traveling and just driving around. And I was like listening to, a friend had told me about like podcasts at the time. And I was like, I didn't know what that was. I started listening. I was like, wow, these things are great. It was like so diverse, and it was so many topics to like hear about and perspectives. And I was like, I feel like I could do something like this, like I've done film stuff. I'm thinking I know what audio, like I'm like, I know I could do some audio stuff. That's probably way easier than the film stuff. And then, so I just started like recording. Like a friend of mine bought me like a little mic. I was like, just had it like sitting in the middle, of the table, just interviewing people about, something that I thought, was an interesting topic, which was driving in the city and how awful it was and like what was making people drive like this. I wanted to understand like the behavior behind the experiences I was having. It's like, this is not how you people are conducting your lives. Like outside of the car, this can't be. Let's talk about this. So when I thought about podcasts, it was like I wanted to do it, and because I didn't know a lot about it, it was like I wanted to do something that was going to be of interest to me and that I could like talk about and have fun and not really like think about how much I didn't know about the space. And that's kind of how like I got into it and introduced to it.
Is there an advantage to the audio medium, I guess specifically in the case of that show?
Well, I guess I would say for specifically what I was talking about, obviously, is safer to not be driving around, having like a whole video set up and that kind of thing. So for me, it was easier and it felt like, like, I felt like everyone was listening to podcasts and it was like so, like I said, the topics were so diverse. So it was like me talking about a show about driving, like people are probably listening to podcasts in their cars, like they're listening to them on the go, like while they're, moving, getting around, and they can actually relate to, my topic I felt was something that was like so relatable because driving is so ingrained in the culture, so whether you are or you're not, there is an experience that people have with driving. And like I said, I thought that was a topic that was kind of like a metaphor for life in a sense, so we could kind of really like talk about something deeper, so where I'm like, yeah, come on my show, we're talking about driving, but then it's like, but how are you dealing with rage and, like all of these things or, these deeper issues, where I felt like people could really get to know you in a different way than someone might in a, different circumstance.
Yeah, sometimes it could be easier sometimes to ask those kinds of questions,
yes,
particularly to people you don't know very well yet, when you're not putting a camera.
Yeah. And people feel more vulnerable to, speak and talk because, like we know with cameras, it's like, it feels like an intrusion, whereas like a mic, you can have it on the table, on the side, and then if you're, interviewing people, you want it to be a little more conversational as well, so you can build that,
Yeah. Well, Trinae, how did you get into
My story is very similar, and we do actually have an episode on the show on CityCast called Traffic Nightmares, and we give resources how you navigate in the city. So my journey started back in 2016. I was a grad student at Drexel, and I didn't know what to do in my life. And so there was a program called NPR's Next Generation Radio. And so that was an experience I had never known about. I applied, didn't get in. The executive director said, all right, we want you to try again. So I tried again. They flew me out to Tempe, Arizona. I pitched a story about a horse training program in a medium security prison. And so what made this experience so unique and opened my eyes to audio was that it was non-narrated. So I could not do voiceovers. I had to learn how to ask questions to get my subject to speak in a complete sentence, a complete thought. And because I was in a prison, I only had one day. So I had to get in, and we spent time, and I got to know him, and what he loved about the horses, and what were some of his goals when he got out of prison. I put that together and I was like, whoa, audio, this is amazing. I got back to Philly, made my way, explored my way into WHYY. I became a mentor to other students who went through the NPR Next Gen program. Fast forward, 2017, I had this idea. I heard this word called podcasting. I was like, what is podcasting? What is podcasting? So I found some rusty, dusty equipment. I would go to the corner stores, get batteries for $1. I really wanted to tell stories about creative Black women in the city. So I would email people, take the bus, take the train, find these women to tell their stories. I sat at my kitchen table, would edit with Audacity, just very basic, free. I would do voiceovers in the bathroom, not a good idea, very echoey. And I started to put this thing together, right? But I was like, I don't think I'm getting a lot of listeners like that other podcasts get. But that wasn't true. There was someone in Chicago who reached out to me via Twitter. They said, hey, we've noticed that you've been doing this podcasting thing. There's a job in New York. Do you want to try it? I'm like, I don't know. Turns out that was with the Wall Street Journal. So I traveled every single day back and forth, Philly to New York, to be an associate producer. I got promoted as producer. I got promoted to be a fill-in anchor. And so that experience, was good, but I needed to get back to Philly and get back to my roots. So this startup company called CityCast. CityCast is, and this is a quick interjection, CityCast is a national network of podcasts. So there's a CityCast Chicago, a CityCast Denver, and we do pretty much similar things where we talk about daily news, recommendations, and then we have our Friday news roundups. So I saw this as an opportunity, and I was like, I could stay in Philly, raise my kids, and so that's how I'm here today.
There's a bunch of threads in Trina's amazing trajectory.
Yeah.
A lot of people ask me, what's the best way to get into podcasting? What's the best way to get into radio? And honestly, one of my top recommendations, partly because the equipment is accessible, maybe it's not the finest equipment, but there's very professional grade recorders and microphones that are just a couple $100s, and sometimes it is just doing it yourself, learning how to use the equipment, and just seeing how it feels in your hands, seeing how just exploring on your own, and
through a couple of mics.
Exactly. It's practice interviewing people. And sure, we all need training too. And I just wanted to also highlight the NPR's Next Gen Radio program, which is ongoing. It happens in cities all around America throughout the year. And if you're interested in getting into radio and podcasting, I definitely recommend that too. Okay.
Trade you. Oh, yes.
Speaking of microphones. So I guess I had a slightly different journey. I spent a chunk of my earlier career as a print journalist. I was an editor of a visitor magazine here in Philly called Where Magazine in the hotels. For about 3.5 years, and wrote for Philly Mag, and way back in the day, the Philadelphia City paper, which sadly is no longer with us. So I love journalism. I love talking to people about their lives, and as I started my own business in 2013, I did a little more behind-the-scenes kind of interviewing, as I mentioned, as a speechwriter, a communications consultant, and also all the while performing. And we have that in common, Alex. I'm also a singer, as you mentioned, and love putting on a show. So I actually, when I started to think about this idea of doing a podcast and came up with the idea of She Rocked It, I really thought of it as a show. I thought of it as a talk show almost. So I always thought there'd be both an audio and a video component. I did really want to have the video side as well, which is a little more ambitious, a little more work. And the idea came to me, as I mentioned, in the middle of lockdown when we were all very isolated and I couldn't perform really at that time and was feeling a hunger to do something more with my business and really elevating women's voices. And so I connected with PhillyCAM, actually, and I've been longtime friends with Laura Deutsch, who's the head of education here, and she actually used to film my cabaret shows here in Philadelphia. Yes, we have a long history. She saw me do tons of shows and film them, and then she started working here. And at some point, she told me about Gabe Castro and the wonderful podcasting class that was being offered here at PhillyCAM. So again, on Zoom in the middle of lockdown, I took the podcasting class as I was thinking, podcast could be a cool way. It's like there's not as many gatekeepers. Like I was like, I want to have a talk show, but I can do my own. I can create my own media channel, a channel that I wish was around. and create She Rocked It and get to interview folks I've really wanted to talk to a little more, or I've had the chance to talk to, but I want more people to hear from them. So I had an awesome experience. That was really one of my first steps to learning about podcasting. So I would say for anyone interested in starting, check out PhillyCAM, check out the resources here in Philadelphia and in our community as well. And then I actually ended up talking to my network and thinking about who could help me, because I knew I couldn't do this alone. So I spoke to my network, and a good friend and former client and boss of mine, Ashley Burke, who is the head of communications for the Philadelphia Orchestra, told me about Tori Marchioni, who was producing their podcast called Here Together, the orchestra's podcast. And she's like, you got to talk to Tori about this podcast. So I brought Tori on board and, invested in hiring her and working with her to help me produce the podcast. So I must credit her as my producer as well to really help me figure this out, because I definitely couldn't have done it alone in terms of the equipment and thinking about all that. I did do mine also from my home for a long time, and that worked out great, but I definitely needed the guidance of PhillyCAM, and Tori's been a great person along the journey as well. And, like I said, it's been over 2 years. And I would also say that in addition to doing stuff like on Zoom and, live, we also used Instagram. I did some of my first interviews on Instagram Live, and then would convert them into the podcast. So we would kind of take the audio from the live, and it wasn't the best quality, to be fair, but that was another way, I was like, I can just do a live with someone, and then I can make that into a podcast. So there's been a lot of kind of ways I've used different formats to get that audio.
You mentioned your producer, Tori, and I'm very biased. I'm someone who's a producer, and I was saying before this, it's sort of funny, I'm the one asked to host this. I'm the one person sitting up here who's not a host. I'm someone who's always behind the scenes helping people figure out what questions to ask, how to set up their equipment, and things like that. So producers are very important.
You're doing a great job.
I'm doing my best. I have a similar question that I had for Tezra, and you're kind of, you mentioned you have this long background in writing and print journalism, also performing, and you talked about this a little bit in terms of why you started the podcast itself. But have you seen specific benefits of going in that direction as opposed to doing written interviews or doing something different?
Did you want me to?
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, well, first of all, back in 2021, there was so few ways of kind of staying connected with people, other humans. And it's been such a beautiful way to kind of meet and be connected with a whole awesome community that without the podcast, including the PhillyCAM community, that I wouldn't have had the opportunity to get to know if it wasn't for this cool medium. Because, when you introduce yourself to someone and you kind of want to get to know a little more, you could say, hey, I'd love to have you on my podcast. It's a kind of cool way to get to know someone a little better. And that's just been a beautiful part of my life and my business. And just also She Rocked It has had the opportunity to work with some really cool brands and organizations as well. In fact, PhillyCAM and She Rocked It partnered with the East Passyunk Avenue Business Improvement District on 2 events. Sergio, who's somewhere around here, was involved in that from PhillyCAM. 2 events called Women Mean Business that we had during Women's History Month, and they were awesome, networking and panel conversations that I hosted. So just opportunities like that wouldn't necessarily have come from my own communications business or performing life. They came from having the She Rocked It podcast and platform, where I had an opportunity to do some really cool stuff in the community and continuing to build interesting partnerships.
Before we move on to some other threads here, we've talked a little bit about some ways we've all gotten into audio storytelling and podcasting. We mentioned NPR, Next Generation Radio. We mentioned PhillyCAM here. But what advice would you all have for someone who's interested in pursuing a career in radio, podcasting, audio? Anyone can take this question. Yeah.
Just start. It's just that simple. Again, you were saying that the equipment, the access, everything's on Amazon, and you can get that. Ask your friends. I crowdsourced literally for microphones with my family. I'm like, hey y'all, if y'all want to buy me Christmas gifts, buy me a microphone, an XLR cable, and yeah, just cold email people that you're interested in. Use your network, and shout out to PhillyCAM. It's just a great start. a great entry point. Yeah, just start.
Say we all have smartphones, like, and they all have very powerful microphones on them as well. So we're walking around with an amazing field recorder in our pocket at all
Yeah, the
times,
voice memos app.
I would agree to just start. I would also say to, get connected to organizations like PhillyCAM or, any number of programs or organizations throughout the city that like train or teach and things like that. I know for me, I had like an interview type of podcast. I know some of you do like more narrative and, storytelling based things, which, you need to know certain things about that. But also I would say, knowing exactly like how your podcast is going to be different or your story is going to be different because there are so many, because of the accessibility, there are so many podcasts out there. There are so many audio stories being told. There are so many communities out here. So having an understanding of like why your story needs to be told will help you to put that passion behind it, and it'll move and connect you in different places than you might anticipate.
One thing I wanted to ask, you're talking about why you're telling the stories you're telling and how you're going to tell them. I think I looked up this statistic recently. I think there's over 2 million podcasts on the Apple Podcast app right now. It can be hard to cut through the noise or to even answer the question, what's the goal? What kind of audience do I have? Do I need to have millions of listeners to feel like a success? Do I just is building a strong, small community around the show what this calls for? And I'm just curious, just kind of open-ended question is, how do you measure success with your shows? And also, how do you find and build audiences for the projects you work on?
Oh,
Karen.
thanks. It's an interesting question and one I'm constantly chewing on. I don't know that I completely have the answer. I think we all probably feel called to do this for a reason beyond like making $1 million from it. Like I feel like I had to do this, and it was a way to get these stories out there and connect with awesome folks, be right here with you all, and that's success to me that I'm having this conversation. I really want more people, though, to hear these stories. That's a focus of mine this year. I feel like the podcast, I've poured myself into it. Women have spent time sharing their stories. So a big focus is to continue to grow our visibility and our audience because, frankly, I just want more people to benefit from these conversations. So absolutely. I'm thinking about different partners that we can work with to get the stories out there. But I'm going to do it no matter what. I'm addicted, I think, at this point. And, like I said, there's different channels. Like sometimes I'll use Instagram and a whole different community will see that conversation. Sometimes people, like you said, want to listen while they're driving. And that's a certain community that's going to hear it on Apple or some other place. Some people want to watch them on YouTube. So I also think like learning how people want to access this information. And I feel like there's a lot of interesting ancillary benefits. Like I said, it's not just for me, the numbers of listeners on the podcast. Like I feel like I'm building beautiful connections with these other, being here, being out in the community, working with some awesome brands and organizations. That's part of what a podcast can do beyond just having like the numbers of listeners, which certainly I want to grow also for the sake of the fact that I think I have a great podcast and I would love more people to listen to it.
I'm gonna answer this question from the approach of like the production of an actual episode, because I think that's we obviously have metrics that we would love to hit for our podcast and also for the newsletter to get new subscribers, new listeners. But our team really thinks about it in the pre-production. So what's our thesis? What are we trying to convey in this particular interview? What's the why, right? And we literally have it written out in our scripts. We then talk about what are we going to actually call this episode, which title we're going to give it, right? Because that also dictates if someone will click on that particular episode. My billboard or my introduction to an episode is really important because I have to get you and keep you and kind of like not give away all of the elements of the episode, but really capture you really quickly and keep you. Making sure that I'm talking with interesting guests, people that can talk about the topic. And I really lean into my own curiosity about the topic. I'm trying to think of an example. Some shows are lighter, like favorite pizza spots in the city. But then some topics that we cover are we're noticing an increase in complications in pregnancy in women in Pennsylvania, and so that was something that I was personally connected to. And so I really was speaking with the health official about my own experiences because I had gone through that. And I'm sure that whoever was listening to this episode has similar questions or is going through something like that. So that's really cool what I get to do. I can like lean into my experiences as a Philadelphian, as a Pennsylvanian, as a woman, as a mother, just as a citizen. So I try to think about, having a good first question, and then kind of my last question is usually like a bigger picture. How do we like zoom out of this experience? So that's like an approach that I take when thinking about who this episode is for. Not every episode is going to be for everyone. I also think about the resources that we can provide, right? So that's in your show notes. You can add links to other resources. So when we have episodes with reporters from all the different media outlets, we always link their full story so that you can read more about the topic. Because we can't cover everything in like 10 to 15 minutes. It's impossible. But if you want to read more about it, you can look at the show notes. So really consider the whole part of your episode, of your podcast, bit by bit of like how you're gaining those listeners.
I'm not gonna front and say like I'm not sad when I look at a podcast episode and it only has like 30 listeners or something like that. That does get discouraging, but I think Karen was saying, you kind of have to think of other ways to identify what success means for your show. And for me, I'm a person who craves for understanding of people. I'm an observer. I love to hear about other cultures, other people. So me being able to create something that gives someone else a platform to tell their story or to connect with other people, or for me, when I'm in that interview, learning about another person or, how for me to be a better person just from what this person is saying, those are the things that are, that means success to me. When I came here today, Karen was like, I came as a guest speaker in one of Gabe's sessions, and that inspired her a little to do her podcast. Those things are success for me. That the things that I'm doing, the stories that people are hearing, that they're benefiting from them, that they're finding value in them, and that they are seeing themselves in those stories.
I love all these answers because I get into a lot of conversations, especially with people who are very new to the medium or see great success that some people have, famous people have with podcasts. And often it's a conversation all about numbers and listeners. And I think there's so many, yes, we want people to listen to our shows, but there's so many other ways to measure success, like the value you're giving your audience, self-edification, putting out things that you value and stories that you want to tell. This is sort of like a related question. How do you stay connected to your audiences and to the community you've built around your shows? Sorry.
There's a kind of full-time job around a podcast, you might say. It involves not only putting a podcast out, but social media time. And that's been the other part of doing this is, I will work actually with another rock star woman from the PhillyCAM community, Erin Phelan, who will clip little sound bites from our podcast and put them on our Instagram and social media so that we are connecting through social media so that people, we obviously can't put the whole episode on our Instagram channel, so I put great sound bites. So that's one thing is I will, again, seek out some help and support to clip little bites and get them out that way. And, I think some of it is just relationship building generally. I love that. I love being out in the world and connecting with folks. I also just want to just add something about the success, if I may. Part of what keeps me going and building community is every time someone says yes to me about anything related to She Rocked It, that's a sign of success and keep going kind of thing. When someone who I really admire says, yes, I'll be interviewed by you, or yes, I'll speak at your panel, that to me also is a sign of success. And we've had some amazing women who have had the opportunity to interview Divinity Rocks, who was on tour with Beyonce. She's a Grammy-nominated songwriter. Emily King, another amazing singer-songwriter, Grammy nominee. Dr. Robin Smith, who's a wonderful author. So when these women, say yes, for me that's, keep going. You're doing something beautiful, and it's also just a way of connecting with other communities. And we, for instance, on Instagram, there's little tricks you do, like you tag that person and then they add themselves as a collaborator on your post, and then it connects with their communities. So that's another thing that's, social media is a whole animal to deal with, but there's beautiful things in terms of connecting not only with your own audience, but connecting with the audiences of your guests and their community. And I can't say enough what a blessing it's been to connect with this whole wider web, the Rockstar Network, I like to call it, of folks that I wouldn't have been able to connect with without doing this podcast.
I think it's definitely possible to make a podcast or a radio show and really just focus on that, on making that. But it really is more than that. If you want to find new audiences, new listeners, it is all those other things that you're talking about. And with CityCast, Renee.
So I'm going to give you a little secret. I do most of my interviews at home in my living room. So we are pretty much remote, but engaging with people it's literally a goal of mine, to get out in the community and do more on-site reporting and conversations. But we really also rely on our contributors. So we have CityCast Philly arts contributor, Charles Tyson Jr., who keeps me connected on the art scene in the city. We just recently linked up. We have a food contributor, Dave Wes, and having those contributors and some of the influencers of the city on the show really helped the reach as well. And so, and again, tagging them as collaborators, engaging, liking the post. Sometimes I respond as just me, and that helps with engagement. But I would love to do more on-site interviews, and if you are interested in being a contributor, reach out to me. I love to chat with you.
I would say connecting with the community, it is something that you have to be very active with because, like we've all stated, audio storytelling, because it's so accessible, and you can do it anywhere. You can get used to being by yourself or very insular, and you can complete a whole project in your house and not speak to anyone else about it. So it is an active thing that you have to get out and get into the communities and in the spaces that you want to connect with people, whether that's businesses or just like-minded individuals. So for me, it was important for me to showcase Black and brown people in my podcast because I felt like those were voices that we didn't typically hear from. And, so in my community, those were things that I would look for. There was a Black woman-owned mechanics place a couple of blocks, from where I live, so those were I was constantly reaching out, to just to speak to, that person to hear about their struggles or their challenges or, the things that they're doing in the community as well. And that enforced, some of the things that I would discuss or talk about in my show. So depending on what it is that you're doing, just finding that community, finding the community that you want to be in and actively going out and having discussion and building partnerships. And, the worst thing that they can say is no, and then you can try to ask someone else, But like I said, it is something that you have to, like, actively do because you can, get caught up in yourself.
I agree. What often happens with audio projects is, you're sitting at home. Maybe you do go out and interview some people. If you go home and you're editing on your computer, maybe you have your team, but then you finishing something that looks like clicking a button on your computer and like uploading it to the internet. And then you're like, all right, I guess I'm gonna go like have dinner. And one thing I often tell people with I work on projects, like, we need to have a party, or we need to go out to dinner, we need to have drinks. I think, you look at the film industry or TV, people have launch parties. And I think still some of those sort of celebrations of the work or outward external celebrations of this kind of work don't happen enough or aren't as built into it. Because I think sometimes I feel like there's something sad about working really hard on something and then being like, all right, well, I guess I just go do the next thing now.
Or we could do more pod swapping, or like we start building a network. There was a thing that helped me get into podcasting when I was making that show earlier. Was the Philadelphia Podcast Festival, and it's no longer around, but if somebody wants to start that again, that was an amazing thing. People got to showcase their work all over the city. We can be on each other's podcasts or something, just to kind of build that engagement a little bit more, because we all are doing this work. So, I don't know, just an idea.
Well, that was a really graceful segue. And that was sort of about my next question, about what you see happening in Philadelphia that both sort of has influenced and affected your work, or things that you would like to see happen to help sort of bolster this podcast and audio storytelling community.
Yeah, so more connecting with each other, I think would help. Let's bring back that podcast festival, Philly style. And yeah, just more showcasing, because like the podcast with the youth, there are so many youth podcasts in the city. And I think the more that you visually see the people, the voices that you hear, the better. And we have spaces in the city to do that. So, yeah, I think we should do it.
I wholeheartedly agree. I feel like, because even for me, I was a newer, like I said, when I started in 2019, it was like right before, I would say, the podcast boom. It was like at that point, people were still asking me, like when I would tell them, they were like, what is a podcast, And I would have to explain it, and then like the next couple months, everybody and their mom had a podcast. I was like, this is crazy, So, and even in that sense, it was like I wanted to be connected to the community, because I had no background in audio. It was like, I want to be, I want to be an audio producer. I want to make stories like Hourglass. I want to, not just do like an interview or a chat type podcast or something. Not to diminish those, because they're great too. But, it was like I wanted to have that depth and that variety and, partnership building in the community. And it was difficult for me as like someone who didn't have any experience, wasn't connected to WHYY, wasn't, into these like big conglomerate, audio based companies in the city. I felt like I didn't have a space, so it was like, me just trying to find something, and then I connected to places like PhillyCAM or, even Alex or, like people that I was just meeting, and then they would tell me about someone else, so like building those connections and being comfortable, like, offering, because I everybody's busy, but being there to like mentor and support and provide resources, especially if you can't be around as well. And that's something that I just try to do. Like if it's something I can't do, I try to definitely, tell you about someone else who, maybe can support or something like that, or another resource. Because, maybe it just means that the audio community really needs to like build something like how you see the film community here, or, the television community. It's like something like that's there and sustainable that, we have, where people know who each other are, whether you're like big time or not, so.
Yeah, totally agree with what you both said, and my mind's going now about what we need and what PhillyCAM can help us with. I mean, I think like a directory is really missing of like podcast resources, because I keep calling PhillyCAM being like, who can help me produce this? Who can help me with my video clips? And Laura's always throwing out great people from the PhillyCAM community, but if there was like a directory of producers and your company's on the directory, and like I call you, like we finally got to meet. I've been wanting to meet you forever, Alex, and so awesome to finally, but like maybe there's some kind of central place of all of like the podcast resources in the city and people who want to get more involved. And I also would love to see something like that for funding and sponsorship. I feel like that's a missing piece. Like there's got to be money and funders and people who want to get behind the work that we all are doing, and like maybe there's also a directory for that, because I feel like this is not something everyone thinks they can start a podcast. In my experience, it's not something for like the faint of heart, or something that doesn't take a lot in certain ways from you, energetically, resources, depending on how kind of far you want to go with it. But I think having some of those contacts at your fingertips could be incredibly helpful if you're really serious about this as a pursuit.
So many good ideas. We have the directory, bringing back the Philadelphia Podcast Festival, just more get-togethers of people who are working in this industry. And just a shameless plug, our company Rohome has a Philly Podcast Mixer. We're doing our second one that we've done. Well, I don't know when this is going to air, but October 26th at Solar Myth in South Philly. And it's kind of just a small way, because I totally agree. There's just not... Again, it's so easy to click the buttons at home and then be like, okay, I'm going to go just see my other friends. But one other thing I wanted to mention, a few years ago, I went to Europe to go to just to see these radio festivals, because I just wanted to see what was happening there. And I had this very memorable experience at this radio festival in Denmark, where I went to a huge movie theater, the kind of movie theater you'd see a Marvel movie in or something. And it was just for a premiere of a radio documentary. And there were hundreds of people in there just sitting and listening. And I was like, and if anyone's had that experience of sitting in a room listening to an audio story, it's really powerful. And again, selfishly, I would say just as powerful as watching some movies or some films. And I would love for like a series like that to happen as well.
Love it.
Yeah. I'm going to open up questions to our audience here. Keith Brand.
So I'm working on a limited edition podcast about, I should know to use the microphone. I'm working on a limited edition podcast about Fire Island, and in particular the two queer majority communities, which are really the oldest ones in the United States. And I'm really interested in queer spaces and how they can foster a really vibrant aesthetic. So literature and poetry and film. And that's going to be kind of the focus of the podcast. But because I want to hire a composer and license music and hire actors, I'm really looking to monetize this thing to a certain extent. And I know that the business has retracted in the last couple years, but there still are networks out there. I'm wondering whether anybody has any thoughts about how you sort of pitch to some of these networks to potentially get them interested in a limited edition podcast.
Jordan, you want to take?
First of all, Keith Brand, I'm a huge fan. Hello, XPN. I think you may have aired my music at one point. Bless your heart. It's, I'm exploring the same thing with She Rocked It, honestly, about trying to find, funding and support. And I think there's a lot of ways to kind of slice that. But based on your, background with XPN, they always had, outreach for money and calling people. And I think some of it is like your network and talking to organizations who'd really understand the mission that you have, which is awesome, and organizations that are funding other things similar. Like I'm always keeping in mind, I was looking at the Pennsylvania Conference for Women of who was sponsoring all their stuff. Like who's sponsoring that stuff? And you have a wonderful reputation and so I would kind of keep your eyes open to organizations who you're familiar with and who might get behind your project and who's kind of also in that world.
I totally agree with that approach of paying attention to who's funding other things. The one thing about podcasting in general, it can be such an independent DIY approach thing that the potential partnerships are infinite. And I think, although yes, it's been a tumultuous year in the media for podcasting, and this is now I'm just kind of giving my opinion here. A lot of it is a lot of those headlines you see about layoffs at places like Spotify and I don't know, some of these other big podcast companies. A lot of those things are these venture capital funded podcast models, and I think they're still clear. Podcasts are more popular than ever. They're only getting more popular, and I just think we need to think creatively about where money is coming from, who might want to partner with you. And my only other piece of advice, I recommend, especially with limited series podcasts, to pilot your show, even if it's a short trailer, but to give people an idea of what it sounds like, what the feel of the show is. And even if you're kind of paying for that out of pocket up front, it's much easier to get your idea picked up or partnered with if people kind of have a really good idea of what it sounds like.
That's a great idea. Can I add one more idea, too? I think that's totally right. We were the first podcast ever done in an Athleta store location, which is part of the Gap family of brands. But how that big brand got behind She Rocked It was I have a beautiful connection with a manager of a local store in the Philadelphia area who really got what we were doing, wanted to partner with us and bring us in, and then she took us up to corporate. And that's how it happened. So also it ended up being a beautiful thing and a first big brand that really aligned with the podcast. So consider also how local connections can get you to national brands and leverage those partnerships, because you never know. Sometimes it's just that foot in the door that really helps.
Any other questions?
I just wanted to, one little plug. The Philadelphia Podcast Festival is a work in progress. It will be coming back looking a little different, but I just wanted to put that in there for y'all. But
Breaking news.
did you have a question? You had a question.
How's everybody doing? Thank y'all.
Great.
You guys
Thank
are
you.
extraordinary and articulate yourselves pretty decent. As it pertains to audience, making the connection with your audience, how much is it preparation versus the intangibles? Is because when it comes to connecting with an audience, I think that that's very important to understand how to separate or compartmentalize the two. So can you express a little bit about that?
So to answer your question, I think, so it's myself, Laura Benchoff, she's my lead producer, and Abby Fritz is my producer. And we're looking for a newsletter editor as well. But we have meetings where we talk about pre-production things. So like what's going to be on our schedule for the week. We talk about ideas that we want. We talk about, who is this episode actually for? Again, not every episode is going to be for every one of our listeners, but we encourage people to share the episodes at the end. And so our newsletter component, which is called Hey Philly, we ask questions to our audience. So that's another way that you can engage with us. And sometimes we translate that information that we got from audience participation, and then we'll make an episode about it.
Any other thoughts on that question?
So you're asking about how to connect with audiences? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that, but there's an element of. I'm sorry if my question wasn't clear. There's an element of when you're speaking to people that is preparation and just a knack, an intangible. And I wanted to know how not to overthink and do more than you need to in the moment, is because this is what creates mistakes that you might not be able to get back from if you don't know how to separate the two, if that's not too much.
Okay, okay. So for CityCast, I have a script of questions that I want to get through. Sometimes I'm doing a lot of active listening. So you might, if we're having a conversation, you might say something, I'm like, Oh, actually, you mentioned about intangibles. Tell me more about that. And so it takes us to a different way, but then as a host and someone who's trained, I know how to like reel us back into the conversation and like I'm looking at the script. So if you looked at my monitor, it's half my script and then half like video of just you and I speaking. But yeah, so my approach, it may not be the approach of your particular podcast, but I might interject or I might interrupt the conversation a little bit in like a polite way, because you might say something and it sparks a whole nother idea. Or maybe you say something in question number 2 that's really question number 7. So I have to kind of do like mental math and move that question up and then go back to the script and like get us back on track. But you have no idea I'm doing that. But as a host, I'm kind of like actively engaged that way.
Yeah, I would agree. I would think it's like a 50-50 thing. Like you want to be well planned, but you also want to plan in that flexibility. Like so have that, be able to be flexible, to move with the conversation, to come up with different ideas as you're thinking about things and not feel so like rigidly stuck to like a structure. And you want to feel comfortable. You want to feel like yourself. You want them to feel comfortable and like themselves. So you want to, have that flexibility. But like some people are, good with winging things and, staying on topic, but having like a roadmap or, a structure or an outline, those things really do help. Just making sure that you're staying on topic and that you're covering the things that you want to discuss, and that it also doesn't allow the other person to go off on too many tangents as well. So it brings some control, but you also have that ability to like, add something else that's not on there.
I wanted to just add though, we're talking about podcasts that are like interview styles. So your podcast could look completely different. Those chat podcasts, like where it's just a bunch of people kind of just riffing on topics, giving their opinions, that's a little like less strict to a script. But then you might have podcasts that, there is a narrator who's like telling you going through the story. And so you interject some sound bites from people. So that's a different style. So the style and the approach that I use Monday through Thursday on the podcast is just a one-on-one interview, or maybe there's 2 people that I'm interviewing at the same time. And on Fridays, it's a little looser, even though there is a script and we are talking about specific news stories. But we kind of like have fun and play around, and it's more conversational.
Just going to add something really quickly. I think you said, I'm going to hand you this too. Thank you. I think you might have said the word overthink. And I just want to say that before I started She Rocked It, I got caught in a lot of overthinking and a lot of paralysis around that. And it took me a long time to go live with the podcast. Now it's like, oh, I've been doing it for a while. But at first, to hit that first go live. So I would just say, give yourself some grace. No, it might not be perfect right away, but you're going to get better as you try it. And if you like look at some Instagram lives that celebrities do, they're really awkward a lot of times. Like some people just like know how to, but they're doing it. They're doing it to get their message out there, right? They're doing it anyway. So don't judge yourself too harshly, especially at first. I can tell you're going to have a great conversation with someone, or I can tell you're going to connect. So just do it and give yourself the grace, because we can often get paralyzed when we overthink and just don't put our voice out there, and then that's a loss, right?
Well, thank you so much for these great questions. We have to, unfortunately, end soon, but I wanted to give everyone the opportunity to have one last opportunity to tell people where to find your work. You start with Karen. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Alex. Thank you, PhillyCAM. Thank you to these rock stars over here for sharing their stories. And SheRockedIt.com is all that we got going on. Instagram, She Rocked It. You can find our podcast on all the major podcast platforms and also on YouTube. Our last season was our first audio-driven season, so that's the one where you can't see video. We are on YouTube, though, just audio. But please check out She Rocked It, and if you love it, please tell someone else about it.
Trinae?
You can check out CityCast Philly on all the major podcasting platforms. Our website is philly.citycast.fm. You can hit me up on Instagram if you want to chat more. If you have a question, if you want me to like sit down and listen with you to one of the episodes, and I can kind of walk you through how to do an interview, or if you want me to listen or get coffee or whatever, I'm around.
Tessera?
And you can find me, like I said, I work for an organization called Love Now Media. You can find us at lovenowmedia.com. A lot of my work is on there. You can find my podcast, Who Taught You How to Drive, on any of the platforms that you listen to. If you want to go to the website, howtodrivepod.com, that's with the number 2. And find me on Instagram at Tezarah, Tezarah.
And again, I'm Alex Lewis. My company's called Row Home Productions. You can find out more about our work at rowhomeproductions.com. Thank you so much for this conversation. It was really a joy. Thank you so much for tuning into this simulcast.